so much for coming. Democracy is fragile. The recent international events have shown us this. Our democracy here too is ailing, and we cannot afford to take it for granted. Over the last few years, we've witnessed time and again a number of egregious events, and we've almost become immune to it. There's been so many. Recurrent rorts of grant systems, pork barrelling, the lack of transparency around lobbying and political decision making, money passing hands for access and influence, blind trusts, government paying 10 times more than the value for land, community grants being given to buy votes, government contracts allocated without due process and scrutiny, a work culture rife with bullying and sexual harassment. Gee, I'm only halfway through. A COVID recovery commission that was stacked with gas executives, journalists having their homes raided by federal police, whistleblowers being prosecuted in the federal courts, the defunding of our democratic institutions such as the National Audit Office and the Freedom of Information Office, the stacking of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal with political appointments, as we saw last week, the ignoring of repeated warnings about impending natural disasters and a failure to prepare for them, and in my eyes, one of the worst things, the government's federal court case where they argued that they did not have a duty of care to the children of Australia. It is no wonder that trust in our government is declining rapidly. In 2022, only 52% of Australians say that they trust government to act in our best interests. Australia's international corruption ranking has never been so low. We were ranked 18th place, and only Hungary matches us for how far we've fallen. Only Hungary has matched us for how far we have fallen in the last several years. A healthy democracy needs fair, free and robust media scrutiny. Not only does Australia have one of the most concentrated media ownerships in the world outside of China, but our public broadcasters have been defunded and white-anted for years. In addition, investigative journalism is hindered by the fact that reporters and whistleblowers can face jail when reporting on terrorism and national security. Australia now ranks 25th in the world for press freedom, and this ranking is too low for us to sustain a liberal democracy. Australia's media must be able to do their job without fear of retribution. I think we're a pretty fair-minded bunch, aren't we? And we want, expect, and deserve a whole lot better than this. Simply put, we want to be able to trust those people that are representing us. We want leaders of our country to make decisions that are in the best interest of ordinary Australians and not sell us out to the highest bidder. We expect public money to be spent in the public interest based on merit and need, and not to buy a party more votes at the next election. We want a government that does feel they have a duty of care to all Australians, and I would say particularly children, because it is their future that we are currently creating. As a doctor, I adhere to a professional code of conduct in which trust is sacrosanct. Doctors are prohibited from accepting gifts and having relationships with patients outside of their doctor-patient dynamic, because we know there is such a great potential for bias, manipulation and abuse of power. And there are repercussions for doctors who do step outside this understanding. Codes of conduct are the norm across the country for professions and for corporations. So we have to ask ourselves, why is it that our national leaders, the most powerful people in the country, are not held to this similar high standard of professional conduct and behaviour? Doctors also swear an oath to first do no harm. And when I look at what's happening in Canberra last year, I see so much harm being done. The Sex Discrimination Commissioner's inquiry reported that 1 out of 3 people in Parliament had experienced sexual harassment, even sexual assault. 1 out of 3. Our government cannot function if it fails half the population. So we need to act now to remedy the unhealthy state of our politics in this country. We need to bring back decency, integrity and accountability to our Parliament. In order to do this, I will support greater transparency on political donations and lobbying and truth in political advertising. It seems a no-brainer. I will fight for a strong anti-corruption watchdog for the federal Parliament to restore trust in our democracy and ensure power is not abused. I will support the introduction of an enforceable professional code of conduct for parliamentarians and their staff. And I will fight to make Parliament a safe and respectful workplace for all people, including women, and I will work to make that a reality for all workplaces across the country. So it is time for a much better way of doing politics and for behaviour in Canberra that sets the standard, the right standard. We need to create a culture in Canberra that is constructive, respectful, and actually focuses on getting the job done. There's a lot of challenges ahead of us. We used to have the Democrat Party in Canberra who were keeping the bastards honest. They no longer exist. So now it's time to vote in more independence so that we can play that role of oversight and holding the government to account and to get these changes that are so badly needed underway. Corruption threatens the health and vitality of our democracy. Corny joke coming, sorry. What we need is a doctor in the House, in Parliament House. I should say as well that we are going to publish our entire integrity and donation reform policy tomorrow on our website as well, and it's very thorough, so I urge you all to have a look at it. And we will be covering a number of the issues tonight that we have covered in the policy as well. So without further ado again, I would like to welcome, first of all, welcome, where are we? Introduce our guests. The Honourable Anthony Wheely, QC, and Saffron Zoma. Thank you very much and welcome. And welcome also everyone who's come along tonight. Thank you for coming. So Anthony is a former New South Wales Supreme Court judge. He was also the Assistant Commissioner to the New South Wales ICAC and is now chair of the for the Centre for Public Integrity. Saffron is a lawyer, campaigner and political strategist with the Australian Democracy Network. Prior to this, she was the Government Relations Manager at the Australian Conservation Foundation, and in 2017, Saffron co-founded the Hands Off Our Charities Alliance, which secured critical amendments to the 2017 Electoral Act to protect the rights of civil society organisations to engage in advocacy. And I must say before we go any further that both Anthony and Saffron are here in a professional capacity. They don't endorse candidates, that's not their role, but we're here to listen to their expertise because they're both leading minds in this field of integrity in Parliament. So, Saffron, I might get you to kick off for us, thank you. Let's just begin our discussion by looking at the concept of integrity. What is integrity in Parliament and why is it so important?
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks. Great question. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here, even though I was a bit surprised by the weather. Didn't bring a brolly because Sydney doesn't normally do this. It's like walking up a river when I was going to get lunch today. But it's really lovely to be here. Thanks for having me. I think we all know intuitively what the answer to this question is, but it's worth saying it out loud. Because obviously in a healthy democracy, when we send someone to Parliament to represent our community, we feel really confident that they work for us and they make every decision with us and our interests and needs and our communities and values at the centre. That's the way a healthy democracy works, and if it works that way, then we should always get decisions which put people and planet and community first. And if you feel confident that your representative is doing their job that way, then I think you can be pretty confident that they're doing their job with integrity. Unfortunately, I think oftentimes that's not the way it feels. And a big part of that, I think, is the influence of big money on our political system, which means that oftentimes our interests aren't first, actually, and it's other interests that are being served. That's a really big problem. The good news is, though, that we do have all of the solutions that we need to make our system work for all of us, not just for the powerful few. We actually have a really well-researched package on our website. You can go to ourdemocracy.com.au and have a look at it. We call it the Framework for a Fair Democracy. So really the final ingredient that we need to fix this problem is political will. And as soon as we have that, we can make democracy work just the way that we want it to, in a way that feels like it really is founded on integrity. So I do feel optimistic, even though reading the newspaper doesn't always feel like a particularly optimistic activity, but we do have the solutions that we need, and talking about these issues together in our communities is the first step to being able to actually make them happen. I bet Anthony has a slightly more technical take on that question though. Do you want to chip in anything?
No, it's very hard to improve on what Saffron says, to be honest, but I think that while endorsing everything she says, I see integrity as it's not too highfalutin a way of thinking about it, as the glue of democracy. It binds us together in a way that makes our democratic institutions work the way they should. And so the hallmarks of this integrity are honesty, accountability, and transparency. And we see those qualities, as Saffron rightly says, when public administration is always guided by what is in the public interest. And when we see the opposite occurring, as happens sometimes, regrettably, in both major parties, I don't want to pick out one over the other. This is a flaw that we see across the board. That is, we see the misuse of power for personal, or political or partisan gain. And it's hard to recognise it because it's always dolled up in wonderful speech and glowing terms as if it is the public interest. But deep down we know it isn't, and that's where integrity becomes completely unstuck.
Thank you. So one of the key drivers that has led independents to stand up and run against this current government this year all across the country is the fact that a Federal Integrity Commission has not been introduced. Not only was this a government election promise, but last term is widely considered to be one of the most scandalous and corrupt in living memory. Anthony, in your opinion, what has been stalling the progress of the implementation of a Federal Integrity Commission?
Well, I began this journey myself about 2015. I was then the chair of Transparency International. I'd retired as a judge and I knew very little about the real world. You know, when you're a judge, you're in a cloister and all you do is you're trying to solve a dispute between A against B, and you'd never get the chance to think more broadly. So after retirement, suddenly I had the opportunity to think a bit more broadly. And one of the first topics I had to deal with was the fact that we did not have an integrity institution at federal level. We do have them in every state and territory. And they're often criticised and there's a lot of malarkey about them and so on, but they're there and they function and they work, and in my opinion, broadly speaking, they do a great job, but nothing at federal level. So that began the journey that I undertook, really 7 years ago, to try and push for this institution. And that took me to Canberra, it took me into the offices of politicians. I remember sitting next to George Brandis, who was then the Attorney General, before a Senate committee meeting. And the issue was, do we need a federal integrity body? And George said, look, quite frankly, we don't. We don't need one because there isn't any corruption at federal level. It's a bit like saying, you know, we don't need a police force. If we didn't have a police force, well, no one would be arrested, and therefore there's no crime. Anyway, that was a rather startling proposition. I'm glad to say that that particular argument's now been resolved. Nevertheless, the battle continued, and it was with great satisfaction in 2018 that we were able to manage, through the Australian Institute and a group of boring old retired judges who were pushing as hard as they could, that the Labor Party agreed to put into its policy that they would have a federal ICAC if elected. Mind you, they were short on detail, but at least they took that step. The next thing we had to do was to persuade the coalition to do the same, and so that meant 3 or 4 trips to Christian Porter's office, where I was very unsuccessful, and so came away weeping each time I flew back to Sydney, thinking, are we ever going to be able to talk these blokes into agreeing? And then, of course, out of the blue, about a year later, when push came to shove, the coalition said, oh, look, we will have a federal ICAC. And I must say I was overwhelmingly pleased, but then they published the model they wanted to have, and I was overwhelmingly dejected because it was quite clear that this was a model that could not be effective. And do I have time just to say something about that? I don't want to bore everyone with it, but it's important to know why I'm saying that. And look, I'm not, our organisation, the Centre for Public Integrity, which is mainly involved with research and then advocacy based on that research, we don't support either party. And I don't want you to think I'm just attacking the coalition on this point, but it's a question of policy. And the policy is you must have an effective anti-corruption body. Otherwise you shouldn't have one at all, there's no point. So what's wrong with the government's model? Well, the first thing is, in relation to the way in which it deals with politicians, parliamentarians, bureaucrats, and 3/4 of the public service, it has a special code which is significantly deficient. And it's deficient in 4 ways. One, the definition of corrupt conduct itself is very narrow. It's a list of specific criminal offences that will constitute corrupt conduct. And we believe that corrupt conduct is a much broader concept than that. Of course, it may be criminal. It doesn't have to be. Let me give you one brief example. So I march into a politician's office. I've got a big stack of money in my hand, and I want a contract out of the government, and I give the minister the bag of money. He takes it, and I get the contract. Now, that's a criminal offence. That's bribery. But look, that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen anymore. Probably used to happen in New South Wales, would be nice. But obviously I never saw any of that.
Say, like, while we've been receiving this lecture on ICAC, he's made this room laugh out loud 4 times. Like, where'd you get the laugh lines from? I'm feeling under pressure.
Yeah, well, it's no laughing topic, but sometimes we have to see the lighter side of things to understand. So let me come back to my example. All right. So I'm a businessman, and I want to get a contract. So what do? I don't go anywhere near the politician's office. I certainly don't put money into a bag. But what I do is I make big donations over a period of 12 months. So maybe $100,000, $150,000 gone into the coffers. And that gives me access to politicians. I sit next to them at a dinner party. I talk about my aspirations. I get to gain a bit of influence with them. And I talk about how good my company is and how well we are doing. What do you know? Before long, there's a process and I get the contract. So that could be corrupt conduct, or it could be just a coincidence. But it's very hard to prove the really core of whether it is corrupt conduct, and that is the reason for my being given the contract. Was it because of the public interest, or was it because I'm a big donor? You can't work that out easily. You need special powers to do it, and that's why you need an effective body. But that is as corrupt as the criminal offence of bribery. So you must look for the misuse of power for personal or political or partisan gain to determine whether it is corrupt conduct. And this model of the coalitions does not indicate that happen. Secondly, you do want to have the ability of whistleblowers to report matters of concern to them. Under the government's model, no whistleblower is allowed to lodge a complaint. No member of the public is allowed to lodge a complaint. It wouldn't matter what you see, you can't lodge a complaint. No one can except the head of the department. Now, if the head of the department is acting corruptly, how do you think that's going to go down? He's not likely to refer himself, I don't think. But it's a really significant blemish that the public or whistleblowers can't lodge a complaint, nor can this commission act on its own initiative. So if I'm the commissioner of ICAC and I read about some scandal where an enormous amount of money's been paid, I can't investigate it. I have no right to investigate it unless the department refers it to me. And finally, there are no public hearings permitted, and there are no public reports permitted. So we never know what happened with the community, and we don't know what the outcome is, unless the criminal prosecution is later launched. So these are very serious deficiencies, and I again stress that I'm not acting politically in saying this, but I was very disturbed by the member for your area, Sophie Scamps, publicly saying that his government's model had all the powers of a Royal Commission. Now that just isn't true. What Royal Commission doesn't hold public hearings? What Royal Commission doesn't make a report to the community of what its findings are? So it's quite, excuse me for using the word, deceptive for a senior member of the government to make that claim. This model is nothing like a Royal Commission, but what we do want is a body that is like a Royal Commission. One where we can see what's happening, we can judge that it's being done fairly, and where we can have an input really as members of the public, and where we can see the result and see what recommendations are made. And to my way of thinking, Jason's remarks, perhaps he didn't intend them, perhaps he wasn't thinking clearly, but they are very deceptive. And then another politician, Dave Sharma, whom I like very much, I've met him, and he's a very pleasant man. He said to me when we were having quite a formal meeting together on this very subject, he said, look, crime's one thing, but we don't want some independent body scrutinising our political decisions. I think that political decisions should be scrutinised only by the electorate at election time. And, you know, I said to him, how would the electorate know, Dave, whether those decisions are soundly based or whether they're based on partisan or political motivations? They wouldn't know. He said, well, we don't want your sort of body looking at our yeah. Fair enough. Well, there it is. Sorry to be so long.
Thank you.
At the risk of only getting through one question for this entire panel, I do just want to add on top of that excellent summary of why we need an ICAC and a strong one. There are like real world consequences if we don't have the ability to trust the decisions that our government makes. And while Anthony was talking, Sophie, I've been thinking about some conversations I've had over the course of the pandemic where people have been sharing with me that they've really been struggling to trust the health directives that the governments in state and federal have been rolling out, because they're like, oh, well, they're just in cahoots with Pfizer. Like, I'm not getting my third dose. This is just about making money for Pfizer. And it's very hard to look someone back in the eye and say, don't be silly, that would never happen, because it's founded in reality. And you know, I'm not a public health professional, but I think that the pandemic is an example of a place where government has to make hard decisions, and we have to be able to trust that they're making those decisions with our interests at heart and nothing else at play. And so the things that Anthony's been discussing do play out in these really critical moments where we need to be able to trust government, and if we can't, there are real life consequences for it. So, okay, next question. Sorry, I'll be quiet now.
All good. I was just going to ask, and either of you feel free to answer as well, is just comment quickly on maybe Helen Haynes's Integrity Commission. Would you be able to do that? Is that something that would address a lot of these issues?
I can go. So on again. I can go quickly. Yeah, we support Helen's model. That's the model that we've adopted in our framework. Because Helen has consulted very carefully with people like Anthony and with the community as well. And I think the key thing to take away from that is not just that her model is a very good one, but that she's done it in the right way. So it's very easy to make these policies in a way that inadvertently creates a disincentive to participate or penalises people unfairly. And Helen's avoided those pitfalls because she's consulted really thoroughly on that model.
Yeah, I'll just add that her model is tremendously effective. That's the difference. And it's effective because it has a broad definition of corrupt conduct. It allows whistleblower complaints. It allows for public hearings. It allows for public reports. And it seeks to protect people's reputation. That's always a worry, you know. I mean, I think someone here in the audience will no doubt say to me, but doesn't the New South Wales ICAC on occasions unfairly treat people? I actually don't believe it does. But if it does, well, that's what all institutions sometimes do. They sometimes fail, and you can always improve them. But Helen's model does have a lot of inbuilt protections to make sure that if there's a public hearing, that a person's reputation won't be unfairly damaged.
Thank you. We did mention bags of money passing, exchanging hands, but Saffron, I might turn to you and just ask about the impact of big money and lobbyists and what impact they're having on our democracy, and how can we reform this?
Yeah, need to skill up on using a microphone. This was a problem last time I was at one of these events too. That's another really big one. We might need to come back another night when we've got an hour just to chat about money and politics. I think a great entry point into this one is the term state capture or corporate capture, if you're familiar with that language. So what we mean by corporate capture is when special private interests, often massive multi-billion offshore corporations or their lobby groups, have so much power that they can exert so much influence over our political system that they're able to get policy outcomes that put their profits ahead of the well-being of all of the rest of us. One of the signatures of corporate capture is that it is always bipartisan. A smart corporation doesn't want to just have one horse in the race. They want to make sure that whoever forms government, they're going to have access and influence. And that I think climate change is really the poster child for how this works. So you have an existential crisis that's going to impact lives, livelihoods, homes, health, all the things. It's really been clear for so long now, and any functional government, this would have been a top policy priority for at least a decade now, while it was still easy to solve. There's just no rational explanation of why our government has done nothing on climate for a decade when we've known that this was coming, and it's been crystal clear all that time. And we're seeing the impacts now: floods, fires, droughts. It's horrendous. My sister and my niece live up near Byron Bay and Lismore, and it was the most terrifying experience being out of touch with them for 3 days and not knowing whether they were okay or not, and then just seeing the appalling way that that community has been supported post-disaster. That is corporate capture in action, and if we don't deal with the influence of big money, then we can expect more of the same, which is why these reforms that cap donations, make them transparent, cap election spending, and make lobbying transparent are so critical, because it actually doesn't matter if the issue that concerns you is climate change or public health or human rights or better education, whatever it is. Our political system is the process by which we navigate and negotiate the big decisions on all of those issues. And if your system is dysfunctional, then you're going to get bad outcomes on every issue that matters. So this is like a threshold to a world where we can actually get the outcomes that serve all of us on the big important issues. It's not more important than any of them, but it's a thing that we have to do or we'll get none of it right. Yeah, that's my general take. We could talk a lot more about the details of donation caps. If you're excited about that, come and grab me afterwards.
And our research indicates that, and a lot of people don't know this, that the worst political donation system that we have around Australia is the federal one. The states, although they're not always perfect, have gradually put in quite a lot of reforms that tend to try and control this undue influence of money in politics. As I say, not always successful, but there's a realm of changes there that have been occurring over the past 8 or 9 years that are encouraging, whereas at federal level there are virtually, well, there are no constraints, and any constraints there are ineffective. So we've been advocating for a reduction in campaign spending. That's the first one. To see someone like Clive Palmer pour up to $100 billion into a campaign is, I would say, obscene. And it's not just the campaign spending. That money comes from a donation, Clive Palmer's own donation. So he donates $100 million, then his party spends $100 million, and he's hoping to get people elected. And if they are elected, we'll be the puppet master for what they do or say in Parliament. So this is really an obscene situation. But let's leave him aside. There are no constraints on campaign spending federally for anyone, for any party or any candidate. There's no constraint on Sophie. She can go and spend whatever she wants. And she'll be criticised if she does by the same parties that do the same thing. But they all do it, unfortunately, and there is no constraint. There needs to be. If we could stop campaign spending or put a limit on it, a reasonable limit, then that would flow through to stop the big donations going. If you can't spend it, it won't be donated. And we need, as Saffron says, transparency around who's donating, and we need to have it in real time. So when you go to vote in a couple of weeks, you know who's put the money into each of the major parties or independents, but you won't know that. You won't know that for another 18 months. So it doesn't help much, does it? And so I could go on all night. So there it is. We do need reform federally, and we're not going to get it. I think neither of the major parties is particularly interested in reform.
Maybe if we have a hung parliament. Okay, so next question. Democracies require institutional checks and balances, but we've seen in recent years that a number of these national bodies have come under attack. They've been defunded, maligned, stacked with former politicians, or simply abolished. Just in the last fortnight, we've seen 120 of so-called friendly government appointments to these democratic institutions, including to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which is supposed to independently review government decisions. So, Anthony, I would love you to talk on this about what is the importance of maintaining the neutrality of the institutions around our democracy to help keep them in check.
Well, we've talked, haven't we, already about the need for integrity, but we do need to have checks on integrity in practice. We've talked about an anti-corruption body, that's one. But there are other bodies all around the federal level particularly, which operate in this way. Perhaps the most important is the Auditor's Office, which has produced a number of reports which have been startling in what they've shown about performance by government in relation to grants. You know, people talk about, I know these are cliches now, but people talk about the sports rorts scandal. They talk about the carpark rorts scandal. But when probably none of you have ever read these audit reports, and they're very long, but they're anything but boring, I can tell you. And it's like a whodunit, but like a Hercule Poirot mystery. I think we suspect the villain from the start. anyway, the point is that in order for those...
Sorry, I have to jump in again. They are nothing like a mystery like that. They're really dull. Do not read it. Just like take it
Well, I
away.
mean, look, that's my fault that I love these sort of things. It doesn't say much for my sense of humour, really. But anyway, so if we don't have those institutions and have them operating at maximum level, then the integrity of public life suffers. And what's happened over the years is that they're all, I won't say they're defunded, but their funding is kept at a very low margin level. Take, for example, the budget, which was published only a few days ago. It's a budget that looks like it's got a lot of money in it for a lot of people, and I suppose a lot of people would sit around saying, oh, that's good, that's exactly what we want. But when you go into the detail of what has happened to funding for the integrity institutions, it's very concerning. Take the Audit Office, which I've mentioned. If you look at we've done a bit of research on it, from 2012 to now, allowing for inflation, we can work out what the level of funding should be today, and we find that when we look at the budget, it's in fact, in real terms, the Audit Office has been cut by nearly 10%. That's quite a lot of money when you're talking about, a body of this kind. It means it can't function properly. It's going to have to cut back on some of its investigations. I mean, it's a really practical worry. It's going to cut back on its staff. So it's not going to function properly. If we look at another one of our institutions that I think really does a good job generally, although it's constantly under attack, the ABC's funding is, in real terms, gone down by about 19%. And the government's proposed anti-corruption body, the budget allows 67 million over 4 years. It couldn't function with a budgetary allowance of that kind. And I'm sure there are other bodies that we've researched, but being the chairman of the Public Integrity Centre, I'm the last one to hear about the research, and I'm certainly very slow in understanding it. But you can go to our website and you'll see a full paper to show all of the accountability institutions and how the recent budget has treated them, and it's not a pretty picture.
I think one thing to add to that, and Anthony, I'm sure you correct me if I'm wrong, but if memory serves, the Audit Office has actually had a budget cut in real terms every budget since 2013. So this is not like a one-off occasion because it was tight this year. It's a pattern of cutting the funding for these institutions that's been going on for such a long time now that if you were able to go back 10 years into the past, you would see these institutions are shadows of themselves, and those two that Anthony mentioned are just a couple of examples. It's a really widespread problem.
Is it the same with the Freedom of Information Office as well? Same story?
Yes, I haven't got the figures with me, but it's been cut as well.
So we've had we might talk a little bit more, if we can, just about the government grants. We've mentioned community grants, but we haven't sort of talked so far about the procurement contracts, how these are also allocated or awarded. So Saffron, let's turn to you.
Yes, okay. Look, I think this question makes me think a little bit about question time. And if you ever talk to a politician and say, you got to fix question time, it's so embarrassing to see our politicians yelling at each other like a bunch of kindergartners. They're like, oh, it's just political theatre, it's all fun and games, everyone loves it. I'm like, no, nobody loves it, everybody hates it. And I think pork barreling, using public money to try and buy votes, is in that category as well. Politicians think that people love to see money being dished out to their electorate, but actually whenever I talk to voters about this, people hate it because they value good process and government that they can trust more than they value a new sports field or a road or whatever it is that's being handed out. I think we're just smarter than we're given credit for, and people can see what's going on and they don't like it. So I'm going to throw to Anthony to talk about how we might fix the current situation, but I think in general terms, if you're the government and you're spending public money, then you need to be spending it in the public interest according to public objective criteria so that people can see why those spending decisions were made and evaluate if they think they were made in a good way or not. And at the moment, the problem is that it's very hard for us to get any kind of understanding of the decision processes. It's very opaque. There's very limited transparency, and so it's hard not to come to the conclusion that it was politically motivated. And for correcting this situation?
Yes, well, the problem is really at heart that the ministerial group all say, well, we've got a discretion to decide what to do, and so we can exercise it essentially in any way we want to. We're not even bound to follow the bureaucrats. Now, that's a problematic proposition because ministers are bound by the ministerial standards statement. So one of the first things we need to do is to make the ministerial standards enforceable. The ministerial standards would, for example, take a decision that is based on a political basis. I'm going to hand out, you know, $250 million to an electorate because I want to win the votes of that electorate. That would be properly understood a decision that would be contrary to the ministerial standards, which requires the public interest to be the only criterion. So, what can we do? Well, I think one of the things we can do is we can try and have an independent body to enforce the ministerial standards. At the moment, it's the Prime Minister. He's the only one who can enforce it. So, no, we've got to be serious about it. I mean, he would tell you that he always does the right thing. He gets investigations. He's trusted the accomplice to do a report, and the report generally clears the minister and says everything was done correctly. So what more do you want? Why can't you be satisfied with that? But I think the answer is to have an independent body to enforce that. I'm not talking now about an anti-corruption body, but just some sort of parliamentary integrity commissioner would be a good idea. Secondly, I think we need to make sure that any grant scheme is promulgated in primary legislation so we all know what the program is and we know what the guidelines and the rules are. That should appear in legislation rather than just in some sort of backroom document that's not really publicly available. Secondly, we need to have reports made to Parliament on a regular basis of how the tender system is operated, who wins the tender, how the program is implemented, and how it looks at its conclusion. And thirdly, we need a joint parliamentary oversight committee to look at the grant program at its conclusion and make a report to Parliament as to whether it has followed the rules and guidelines effectively. So that's pretty simple, isn't it? But I'm afraid we don't have anything like that at the moment.
Thank you. How are we going for time?
Time for some questions.
I might ask one last question and then we'll get into some Q&As from everyone. Thank you. I guess there's a couple more things that we haven't touched on, and one of them is the Stop the Lies bill that Zali Steggall introduced, and also the other one was just thinking about that professional code of conduct and an enforceable professional code of conduct, and also the what should we do about gender equity? Sorry, massive stuff. It's a huge issue, but introducing the recommendations of the Set the Standard report and things like that as well.
I'm not sure I can do justice to those three massive little postscript questions. In terms of the code of conduct, I think the key thing that strikes me there is that I see at the moment we're in a kind of vicious circle of people seeing bad behaviour by our elected leaders and then feeling very demoralised and checking out and lowering their standards of what they'd expect, so that the next time they see bad behaviour, they're like, oh, what would you expect a politician? Of course, they're corrupt. And we need some way of intervening in that cycle so that we can rebuild trust in politics, which is really above any kind of party political anything. It's just we have to have a system that we can all trust, or none of us can get anything done. It's all going to fall apart. And I think a code of conduct is one way that we can say, no, actually we do have high expectations of our elected leaders, and if they don't reach those expectations, there will be consequences, like people might lose their jobs, just like in any other profession where standards aren't met. So I think that code of conduct, while it's certainly not a silver bullet, and code of conduct is not going to make every politician behave themselves, but I do think it's a really important step that we can take to rebuild the trust infrastructure that we have. And it shouldn't be that hard to do, like it's pretty straightforward. We've got a lot of examples to draw on. In terms of the Jenkins report, I just think, apart from the issue of should we all be safe at work? Yes, we should all be safe at work, and Parliament House is currently not a very safe workplace for staff or for politicians, and it's really distressing when you see some of that up close. But I think it just is really in the same vein, when we constantly hear this trickle of horrible stories about how business is done there, it's very hard to trust that politics is being done with integrity. So to me, it's a no-brainer, and I think it should happen in the next Parliament.
Can I just add, has anyone in the room read the Parliamentary Code of Conduct at federal level? If you have, put up your hands. No, but I'm sorry to tell you there isn't one.
One paragraph.
There's a statement of ministerial standards that only applies to ministers, but there is no code of conduct for the ordinary member of Parliament at federal level.
Well, they're fulfilling it, aren't they?
But really, that's a really sad commentary, isn't it? And don't think that it hasn't been debated. There was one for a while, and then they abandoned it, rescinded it, and then there have been other attempts to bring it in, but nobody really wants it. Because it's scrutiny, and they don't really want too much scrutiny. Look, there's a lot of honest people in Parliament. Let's be truthful about it. Really good politicians and parliamentarians. We shouldn't dismiss everybody. That's not fair. But there is not adequate institutionalised scrutiny, and that's what we need to improve very significantly.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful way to wrap up that part of the panel. And now we'd love to throw to questions from the audience.
Nora Smith-Whitman, I'm sent down from Belrose in the Hills District. Belrose Dog Park. Oh, by the way, you can get my bespoke tailors details on the website. We don't have the language up there that you three have, so I'll put this quite simply. I always believe when you want to get stuff done like this, you need very positive anger. It's got to be channeled, but you need to be angry. Otherwise, you're wasting your fucking time. My question to you three, and to all of the people you work with, how fucking angry are you? If you want to know what it means, come up to Belrose Dog Park and ask us all.
Look, I had a very comfortable life, and a lot of people ask me why on earth I'm doing this to myself. You've got to be pretty angry, I think, to step into, to want to change your life and actually make a huge difference. I think a lot of us feel not only anger, but distress. And the thing we want to turn it into is some hope. And I think that's the thing that people have been coming to me and saying, thank you so much for stepping up, because for the first time in years, I'm feeling hopeful about the future. So that's what we've got to turn that anger into action and hope, and that's what we want to do here in Mackellar as well. I think we saw it happening last time around. I think we did see that hope and that fun and that positivity and the optimism next door in Warringah last time around, and we all were looking over there thinking we want a bit of that, and hopefully we get it this time. So thank you everyone for being involved. Thank you.
I've got a question.
Would you like to come up to the front? Is that how we're managing it? Okay.
Private members' bills rarely get up in Australia. So what are the chances of Helen Haynes' Integrity Commission going forward? Are Labor likely to support it?
No, they didn't support it when it came up in the recent round, but it was a close call. One government member crossed the floor. We only needed one more to cross the floor, and it would have then been moved on for debate in the lower house. In the Senate, a similar thing happened, a very close call where the numbers were only defeated by that much. Unfortunately, Pauline Hanson took a different view from Jackie Lambie, and that meant it didn't get up. But But look, it is hard. The answer is it's very hard. But I would think if we have a couple more independents, present company accepted, of course, in Parliament, that those numbers would change. And therefore, a bill like Helen Haynes' could move on for debate. It's not supported by Labor, but I think that's only for political reasons, because they want to introduce their own way and get the credit for it. But it'll be a damn good bill if it's as good as hers.
I just wanted to add to that as well that the independents have a really powerful role in leading the national conversation. So ever since Helen has introduced that bill, it's been something that the national media has been focusing on. I don't think I was aware a few years ago that there was no federal integrity commission, and Helen's bill has focused that spotlight, the media spotlight, and has led the national conversation with her. I think it's top of mind. This is one of the biggest issues in this election. So it's interesting, you have to build that wave of support, and that's what an independent does. They're able and free to lead national debate because they have the freedom to introduce these bills when otherwise they'd be hidden in the shadows behind the talking points. It doesn't reach the talking point page.
Can I just add that Helen Haynes is actually a lovely person.
Yeah.
And she really is. And I've met her a couple of times and so impressed by her. And she said to me, you know, one of the most refreshing things in my life is that I'm not bound by party politics. And she said
No factions, only people in your community. Oh, sorry, are you organising the questions?
Yeah. The gentleman's hand up here.
Hi there. My name is Dan. I've done quite a lot of work over the years, sort of in the political sphere, public service, but particularly with young people and particularly around climate change. And I'm quite passionate about integrity, but when you speak to young people about their concerns, it's often climate change is first. Things like integrity are kind of a second order issue. I guess my question is, what would you say to young people who are really concerned about something like climate change about why integrity is really important?
I love that question. I have spent the last decade and a half, that's how old I am, working on the climate crisis. Because I have 3 children myself, I'm very committed to us having a habitable planet for them to live on. That's a real priority for me. And we don't have another one, as we all know, so I feel really determined to stay optimistic about the fact that we can get there, we can turn this around, and there will be somewhere for my kids and their kids to live. The only reason that I started Australian Democracy Network is because after 15 years of trying to get action on climate as just like, all right, something's missing here, how come we can't win when the public interest, the imperative for action could not be clearer, the economic imperative could not be clearer, the health imperative could not be clearer, the beautiful barrier reef and alpine ecosystems and kelp forests and mangroves that we're losing them now. That's not like a problem 10 years from now. It feels so incredibly urgent. But if you walk around Parliament House, you would think that there was absolutely nothing going on. So, if we don't have a political system that is capable of delivering the ambitious solutions in the timescale that we have left, we are not going to win. And if climate change is your first issue, that is great. Like, that means you're awake. You see what's going on in the world and you understand it. But if you don't fix the integrity problems that we have, you're going to lose. So you should get on board with both. It's not one or the other, unfortunately. We need to prioritise both.
I just also wanted to add to that I think it's really, really important to bring young people back into their democracy, because they just feel that they haven't been heard for so long, and so of course you switch off, it's a switch off. So what we're trying to do, or what I'm trying to do, is tell people we're listening, we want you to come in, this is your future that we're creating, and yes, integrity, all those decisions, good decisions, bad decisions, come from up the top, whether there's integrity at the top level. Thanks, Dan.
Hi, my name's Guy. I've got a question about government appointments. Now obviously we elect a government because it's a government responsibility to make appointments. But as a voter I get a bit frustrated, just a couple of scenarios. One, 5 minutes before this election, this government's now appointing a whole lot of key judicial and other people to power, your appointments, which I would have thought should be left to after the election. The other one is relating to climate. You know, I guess in getting to the zero emissions by 2050, the government appointed Andrew Liveris to be a key climate advisor, head of Dow Chemicals, a well-known fossil fuel lobby man. Surprise to surprise, he recommends a gas-led recovery. Is it corrupt behaviour in that sort of sense to make those sort of appointments?
That's a difficult question, isn't it, that last one? But let's go back to the first. We'll maybe come back and reflect on it. As far as the appointments are concerned, it's very clear that both parties have done this at election time when they're in government, that is to appoint a great slurry of people about 2 or 3 days before the election is called. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? The solution is, I think, to have a better appointment process where people are appointed on merit after consideration by an independent board, so that don't just take people who are you know, staffers in the political offices and who are a bit worried the government might lose the election, and then that's the end of their chances of getting an appointment. So they all get shoved on there. But as Sophie remarked, the real danger is that that sort of appointment process results in bodies like the Administrative Tribunal being skewed in a way when you expect these people to act impartially when they review government decisions. They don't. They just simply follow the government line. Not everyone, of course. I'm not suggesting that it's an enormous problem, but it's certainly a problem. As to your second question, that's really a hard one, isn't it? It comes back to the previous question and the previous answer, where we've looked at climate change. I'm not an expert on that, but I believe that integrity is woven into that debate really powerfully. And critics of the government, I've no idea whether these criticisms are justified, I wouldn't pass an opinion, say that the government is imposing a kind of fraud on the community. For example, carbon capture. We saw articles published last week by very eminent people who described the carbon capture and storage and the carbon credit system, and it was described as a fraud. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but if it were true, that would be an absolute affront to integrity on this climate change issue. So we need to explore it, and I hope people much wiser than I will do just that. But ultimately it comes back to the community. You have got to express your opinions on this. You've got to say, we want this question, and the sooner you do it, the better.
If you're up for an 80-page read, I would definitely recommend you hop over to our website, which is australiandemocracynetwork.org.au. We just published a big report that we're called Confronting State Capture, and this question that you're raising is really connected to the story that Anthony told before about the bag of money. There are a lot of ways that powerful private interests influence politics. It's not a simple thing, it's not a bag of money. And one of the ways we call the revolving door, where people move from industry into politics and back into industry, and this is rife. We have a big chunk in the report just full of examples about different ways that industries use that revolving door to capture regulators, to repurpose regulators, and to put themselves in positions of high influence in political decision-making offices. It's a huge problem, and there are ways that you can deal with that, like requiring cooling off periods for people when they finish a ministerial job. They can't just jump straight into a fancy job in the industry that they just finished regulating, because that's such a clear conflict of interest. But it's a really important point and not often that well understood. So I even actually have a couple of copies of that 80-page report in the other room, so come and find me later if you want to read it.
What page is Julie Bishop on?
I can't remember the page number, but yeah, she's in there.
Margaret, just a brief follow-up question to that. we all agree that it's not a good process to be appointing people to these tribunals at the last minute. We all agree both parties do it. What's the political answer for doing something about it?
Can I take this one? It's such a great question because I think it's crystal clear that we need better laws. Like, our laws are so far away from best practice that it's no joke, even though Anthony has made so many tonight.
I haven't boasted about my website.
I wasn't boasting, I was just telling them where it is on the internet. Goodness me. But I think there's a whole piece of this problem that is not legislatable. You cannot legislate away some of the fundamental problems that we're talking about tonight. We need a change in the narrative that we have about politics and our role in it and what our job is as citizens and how we relate to power and decision making. And we need a different culture, because the fact is right now that you can be a political party and you can engage in all of these legal but not really ethical behaviours with zero consequence. Like, I could be the health minister, Anthony could be like the CEO of a junk food company, and he could come and be my chief of staff and no one would raise an eyebrow about that. And so I think part of this is just like expanding our minds beyond like what kind of legal changes do we need, and be like, well, what are we willing to put up with as citizens? And then there has to be political, social and economic consequences for people who don't do the right thing. And until we do find ways to create those consequences, I think those behaviours will continue. So it's really good to just think about, like, what would that look like? What would a political culture look like where those things didn't happen? Like, I imagine Gina Reinhardt putting on a party in the Grand Hall at Parliament House, and like the member for Mackellar calling her up and saying, oh, I'd love to come, but like my electorate really don't like to see me in photos with you because they don't want any like backroom deals happening, so I'm sorry, I can't come. Or like the health minister appoints a junk food CEO as the chief of staff, and there's public outcry and they have to like sack that person. That doesn't happen right now, but it could. And these are the kinds of community conversations where we can together decide like what are the standards that we expect, and like we're not going to put up with less than that. So I think that's a great question.
Up the back, thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for your presentation, so excellent. And yeah, as a young person who is so like profoundly disappointed how our governments have failed us, but also deeply committed to the democratic process, I'm really so grateful to you, Sophie. And my question is, you've painted a picture, and we all know the current situation is really woeful. Does that represent an erosion over time, over recent decades, both culturally and in terms of the institutional framework? I guess that's the first part of my question, and yeah, at the federal level. And then also, where is best practice around the world on integrity in government? Thank you.
What have I told you about my website?
Centre for Public Integrity, and the other one is Australian Democracy Network.
Look, I think that's a really difficult question to answer because, you know, I'm not a historian, and I imagine that if we went back 50 years, we might find that the situation was dire in many other respects. But certainly over the last 15 years that I've been involved in this issue, I would say it has deteriorated and continues to deteriorate, particularly because of the absence of those qualities that I mentioned in the very first answer I gave Sophie, and that is
a sense of honesty, a sense of transparency, and a sense of accountability, particularly the latter. I think the absence of accountability in government at the moment is at its lowest ebb, and I think that's been increasing because the people in politics and the public service, in one sense, feel they can get away with it.
I find this framework useful. Like, if you think of 3 circles, like public life, this is one way of like theorising about public life. So one circle is civil society, the public. Another circle is the state, so government, and then the third circle is business, corporations. So over the last decade, we know that membership of churches, political parties, community groups, any kind of community-based organisation have fallen really steeply. Less people are connected to an organisation with other people who have shared interests or concerns, or a place where they can have community. And so that circle is shrinking. And we know at the same time the corporate circle and the amount of money that they're putting into the political system and the amount of lobbyists that they have on their books has actually increased significantly over that same period of time. So I think there's like a dynamic where the state is being pulled more and more that way. And we need to rebuild our community engagement so that we have a more balanced system and we can get outcomes that are more balanced. So I do think there's been a historical trend. And in terms of best practice, I don't think there's one place where I would say, oh, like this place has nailed every single aspect that we've talked about tonight. But on any of them, I could point to a state or another country that is doing it so much better than federal politics in Australia. So we have heaps of examples to draw on where best practice has been instituted, and we've got models that we could use. And I think that just makes it all the more reason why we shouldn't wait any longer, just get on and do it.
I was just going to add very quickly that I think it's so exciting that there's so many different community-backed independents rising up, because people are feeling so disconnected from their politics, and so that ability to genuinely represent your community, I think, is so powerful. So hopefully there is some hope in the air for us for change, because it's not just happening here; it's happening across the country with this Voices movement, where the main aim is to listen to the people in the community and represent that in Canberra. So hopefully that gives us some light at the end of the tunnel.
Hi there, my name's Sonia, Purchase Forest. You mentioned junk food companies. Well, I used to work for a very prominent junk food company in marketing, and even our marketing, we used to have truth in advertising. And if we were saying one brown fizzy liquid versus another brown fizzy liquid was better in terms of tasting, we used to have to back it up. So my question really is for Anthony: why is there no truth in advertising in politics?
Well, there is in business, as you say, and we've now, the Trade Practices Act has great scope for actions for misleading and deceptive conduct, and that's been a tremendous innovation in corporate life. And so we do have it in two of the states in Australia. We have legislation that requires that factual statements in political advertising be accurate. It doesn't affect expressions of opinion, which can be wildly inaccurate, but that's what freedom of speech is about, I suppose. So again, I don't think there's any appetite to do that. If you're spending millions of dollars on your campaign, you don't want anyone to circumscribe you by suggesting that you have to be truthful. I mean, heaven forbid, what do you want about? And so that's the problem. There's no appetite for reform in that area either. When we mention it, when we go to Canberra and talk about it to both the major parties, we get a blank stare as if to say, well, what's that about? So there's no appetite for it. But again, the need for it's got to come through from policy that's driven by independent people, that in turn is driven by the community, which is sick of this sort of lying in, the terrible statements that are made, more often than not, in expensive advertising campaigns that are just totally misleading. We wouldn't, as you say, we would not allow it in corporate life. We wouldn't put up with it if it was our neighbour, and yet we just go on unconcerned and unperturbed in political advertising. It's really got to be brought to an end.
Andre?
Hi, Andrew from North Narrabeen. So, when it comes to donation reform, I think a lot of the proposed reforms are pretty obvious. But here's a question I'd like to ask. In a functioning democracy, is there any reason at all for a business or a corporation to be able to donate to a political party?
Well, Michael Yatsley is putting this idea out now. Michael, who doesn't mind me saying this, I'm sure, was the was the Liberal Party bagman for many years, and he's been on the road to Damascus and fallen off his horse after a lightning bolt struck. And he's now suggesting that we ought to reform the system in precisely that way, so only individuals can donate. But it is interesting, isn't it? I think the trouble with it, there's, from a legal point of view, there is the concept of the freedom of political expression, which is recognised in the law. You can't shut people up from expressing their opinion politically, and I guess that applies to corporations as well as to ordinary individuals. So I think that's one thing in the way. And the second thing is the broader issue of freedom of speech, and freedom of participation. Everybody should be able to participate in the electoral process, even if you're just standing with a beautiful Dr. Sophie t-shirt on and handing out posters, or if you're cooking some sausages on the barbecue nearby, or if you're donating money, or if you're spruiking in the community. These things, they're part of democracy. We want that to happen. Should we stop corporations from doing that? That's a difficult issue. What do you think, Saffron?
I actually think that we can get there just by capping donations to a very modest amount, because the problem is that you don't want people using their donations to buy more influence than they really should have. And if you cap donations at a modest amount where, that amount of money you're really not going to be able to buy influence, then I feel like we don't even have to grapple with that question because it kind of becomes moot in terms of the practical outcome.
Can I just say something about people like you, Sophie? Because I think the independents have a particular problem here. Here's an independent person struggling to get elected for the first time, or somebody who is an independent who's like Zali Stegel, who's been elected. They're at a disadvantage to the other major parties. Our donation system really looks at everything as if it were a two-party system, but it isn't. So we've got to give long and careful thought if we're going to cap donations and cap campaign spending, is where do we fit the independents into that? In theory, everybody should be equal, there's no doubt about that. But how you do it in practice is quite difficult, because otherwise you're going to see independents squeezed out just when we want them to be there.
National Bank scrapped them 2 years ago.
Well, they say they did. But, a lot of the companies say we don't make donations, but they still have major fundraisers, because the definition of donation doesn't include the 150,000 I pay to sit next to the Prime Minister at a private function.
I do think that's a good point, though, because the fact is, if you did cap election spending and stop that constant arms race of needing to raise more and more and more, so you could blast us all with TV ads every minute of the day between now and the election, you stop that arms race, then the people who are seeking to get election don't have to raise as much money. They don't have to lower their standards of who they take money from. They don't need to take as many big donations. So I actually think a lot of the donors wouldn't be as disappointed as you'd think if the system changed, because they don't necessarily.
Shares. My suggestion is get the shareholders to get up. I do it on a daily basis.
Shareholder activism is a great tactic, I agree.
Can I just ask as well, because I know the New South Wales state government has banned from certain industries, liquor, gambling, tobacco, property developer and fossil fuel, is that right?
Don't think fossil fuel.
Not yet.
We're a bit careful not to go that far. Yes, certainly the gaming industry and the hotel and property developers would be the main ones. Yeah.
Again, we haven't supported that model because we think that you can not single out preferred participants and people that we don't think should participate. You can fix that by just capping everybody at a modest amount, so it's completely even-handed, it applies across the board, but no one has more influence than they should.
You talked a lot about influence and influencing institutions. How do you feel about the influence that you have in media? So obviously there's a significant person that has a lot of influence. How do you deal or tackle with that kind of influence?
Are you talking about the Catholic Weekly? Oh, no.
Did everyone hear the question? question. It's about media influence and I guess that concentration of ownership.
Okay, Anthony stopped me in to take this one. So this is a super complex issue, but I think a good place to start is acknowledging that a healthy media ecosystem is a pillar of a healthy democracy. And every time I speak about our stuff anywhere, people raise their concerns about the state of our media right now. So people know that it's not in a good shape. They're very concerned about concentration of media ownership, political agendas through the media, connection of big business and media and politics, and the way that we can't even really see how those connections operate. But the solutions are actually really tricky because you want to go very carefully in this space and make sure that you're not clamping down on freedom of expression. And so I actually think we need to do quite a big piece of work in this space, because we also need to acknowledge that the whole media landscape has really changed over the last little while. Like, the traditional media is functioning in the context of online and social and bloggers and all the things. And to be honest, we're just not going to solve it before the election. And it definitely needs to be a priority for the next Parliament. So the thing that I like to say when this comes up is, because we're not going to solve it before the next election, there is one thing that we should all really keep in mind, which is that every piece of research tells us that the gold standard of persuasive political communication is a one-to-one conversation between a person and someone from their community that they know and trust. So all of us have the antidote to the problems with our, big media at the moment. The question is, can we scale it? Like, can we have enough conversations? But I really think right now it's important not to just feel despairing and disempowered. The media is a huge problem, I completely agree. And I think the right thing to do about it right now is be talking to everyone in our networks about the things that we care about, helping people to identify disinformation and misinformation and poor quality information, and sharing good resources. We can have a huge impact on the information that the people in our networks rely on, and that's really important to remember.
I think that's wonderful. Maybe we'll finish up there, because that's a wonderful message to finish on. And so everyone, get out there and talk about what is important to you. It's so important, those one-on-one conversations. And I would like to thank you both so much for talking tonight. It's been such a fascinating discussion. Saffron's over from the Australian Democracy Network, that's her website. and Anthony Wheely, who is the chair of the Centre for Public Integrity. That's his
Before signing off, can I say, I don't want you all to slap off home and watch Sky News after dinner.
Thank you everyone for coming along.